If Jesus wasn't created, then why is he called the firstborn of creation? Does being called the firstborn of creation mean that Jesus was created? This is the claim that Jehovah's Witnesses will make when they're explaining to you who Jesus Christ is. We saw in the last video that only begotten didn't imply being created or made, but a unique one or one of a kind that was brought forth or presented. This was backed up by Hebrews 11:17, as Isaac is called an only begotten son, and doesn't mean only to be birthed or created, because Ishmael was Abraham's first son. Next in their claimed list of verses is Colossians 1:15 and 18. In the KJV it reads, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation." And moving down, "And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that is in all things he may have preeminence." Now compared to the New World Translation, it says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. And he is the head of the body, the congregation. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might become the one who is first in all things." From our first video, we noted that Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus, but only that he was resurrected in spiritual form. So his body was annihilated in some fashion after his death. What this means in a Jehovah's Witness Christological standpoint is that Jesus was recreated after his death because they don't view humanity having two natures of body and soul. They view that there is only the flesh, so that when you die you're in a state called soul sleep, until God awakes you or resurrects you back to life. So in their Jesus scope and sequence, God created Jesus first in spiritual form, then he took on flesh and died, and then after his death, God annihilated his body, but then recreated Jesus back into his original spiritual form that he had in heaven prior to coming to earth. So that in their interpretation of Colossians 1:15 and 18, the firstborn of creation and the firstborn of the dead are both related to him being created and recreated by Jehovah. A quick comparison of verse 15, we see that they are pretty much the same. You see the difference between the words of and over after firstborn, but looking at other translations, you see there is pretty much an even split on which word they chose to use. But we'll come back to that. Then verse 18 is pretty much the same as well, except they always say congregation instead of church in the New World Translation. The last line with first place in all things versus preeminence is fine with either translation as well, and you can see there's a pretty even balance with versions, and the NIV said supremacy instead. This should already give you an idea what this verse is really talking about. It's saying at the end that Jesus ranks higher than everybody now. But the issue really goes back to, does firstborn mean that Jesus was created, and in the context created twice in the Jehovah's Witness view? Now I could shortcut you to the simple answer, but where's the fun in that? And we're also here to learn our Bible a little bit better as well. Jehovah's Witnesses claim that verses 15 and 18 describe Jesus' creation. But did you notice something about only using those two verses? How about verses 16 and 17 right between them? Or how about verses 1 through 14 or 19 and thereafter? Now you're not going to typically, cite a whole chapter for your theology or your Christology or whatever have you. You usually just pick a couple of verses for, your statements of faith. Those verses aren't allowed to be stripped away from the rest of the context. Context drives meaning and interpretation. So looking at verses 15 through 20, the KJV says, "Who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature? For by him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have preeminence. For it pleased the Father that in him should all fullness dwell, and having made peace through the blood of his cross, by him to reconcile all things unto himself, by him, I say, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven." Keeping the Jehovah's Witness claim in mind, verse 16 clearly says Jesus created all things, and verse 17 says he was before all things, meaning that he was pre-existent or eternal before creation ever took place. I don't know how much easier you need it laid out for Jesus' eternal existence than that. Well, what was the barrier between these types of verses and a Jehovah's Witness? That's right, their New World Translation Bible. In their translation, they add the word other 5 times to Colossians 1. You can see those in yellow in verses 16 through 20. And just by coincidence, they were all inserted when the context was describing Jesus' deity and eternal status. This is another step showing that the Watchtower Society tweaks their translations to fit their beliefs. You might say, Brett, that's a pretty big accusation. Well, I'll prove it to you. All right, go to jw.org and go under Publications and click on Online Bible. Now open up 3 different tabs for the 2013 revision, 1984 version, and also their Kingdom Interlinear translation of the Greek Scriptures. Looking at the original Greek, we have in verses 16 through 17 4 places where they inserted the word other. You can see that we have a question mark because the word other in Greek is heteros and allos, so Paul, when writing to the Colossians, did have 2 Greek words available if he wanted to specify something separate versus referring to everything. Then the 5th time the word other is inserted is in verse 20. Now when we go to the 1984 version, you can see in the red boxes that the Watchtower Society did indicate that they inserted the word other on their own choosing because they put brackets around them. Now we do have to note that at some point translators do take some liberty when translating from one language to another, but it's never acceptable to add or subtract words when it changes the meaning of the context. And quite clearly, if you add the word other in here, it changes the whole scope and sequence about who Jesus is. Now looking at the 2013 revision, you'll see that the brackets are removed from around the word other. This now simply looks as if this is the natural reading to the text. So the Watchtower Society knows that the Greek words for other are not in any of the Greek manuscripts, but they did insert it in the 1984 version with brackets, but then removed the brackets in the 2013 revision. So the first it's clearly missing, then they insert it in themselves, and then they finally present it as a proper translation. If you're discussing Colossians 1 with a Jehovah's Witness, this might be something that you want to point out to them, because it's clearly shown on their website that they went from the Greek to the 1984, the 2013, and there was clear transitions between all of them, and that it does clearly change the context of the passage. So at this point, they might do what a lot of people do when they know they're being called out. They punt, meaning they're going to kick it right back at you and ask you, what does firstborn mean then in verses 15 and 18? First, be aware the word firstborn is part of a descriptive clause. So the first description is Jesus is the firstborn of creation, and the second one is that he is the firstborn from the dead. So we have the word firstborn being used in 2 different descriptions. In verse 15, Jehovah's Witnesses make the claim that this is describing how Jesus was the very first thing created by God. Now they need to be consistent with that usage of the word firstborn in verse 18 as well. If firstborn means to be first created thing in verse 15, then in verse 18 it should mean that he was the very first in chronological order to be risen from the dead as well. This is important because we can ask, was Jesus the very first to be risen from the dead? And the answer is no. He actually was the 7th to be risen from the dead in the Bible. The first 3 occurred in the Old Testament with Elijah and Elisha. Then Jesus is recorded raising 3 people before his own resurrection. Then after his resurrection, we have those who came out of their graves, Peter raising Tabitha, and Paul raising Eutychus. Now, we know that Jesus was the first that didn't have his second death, whereas all those others would have died a second time. But we're not going to get into that. So we can turn the table back on them by asking, if Jesus wasn't the first to be risen, then what does firstborn from the dead mean? At this point, you have to develop the skill of remaining silent, but also insistent that they answer the question. If they are experienced, they will try to quickly change the topic or punt it right back at you. This is one of those situations where you have to read how the person is responding to your counters. It's a delicate game in that you have to remind yourself that you're not trying to win the argument. You are trying to get them to have doubts about their beliefs first. Winning is not the goal. Your concern is over their soul and their eternal destination as it stands at that moment. So your Christian love and your compassion needs to be on your body language. So now we can actually show them what firstborn means. They want you to only look at the immediate use of the word firstborn in verses 15 and 18. But we're going to stress that the entirety of that section needs to be brought to light to understand how Paul was describing Jesus. Verse 16 reads, "For by him all things were created, that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and for him. This is clearly saying Jesus created everything in heaven and on earth. Verse 17 says, "And he is before all things, and by him all things consist." This is describing Jesus as eternal, since he was before all things that were created. The first part of verse 18 says, "And he is the head of the body, the church." Jesus has full authority over the church as its great high priest. The second part of the verse says, "He is the beginning," which is translated the word arche, where we get the word architect from. This means Jesus is the originator or architect of all creation. It's not describing a starting point in time like, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." So when you break down verses 15 through 18, you will see that there are 7 descriptions that Paul has for Jesus, and that 5 of the 7 that Jehovah's Witnesses don't reference are clearly about Jesus' rank and position. So to be consistent within the text, the firstborn of all creation and firstborn from the dead would also be referring to positional status. If you don't think that is being consistent, then your stance is that Paul just embedded a couple out-of-context events between the rest of them. And what purpose would there be in that? Understanding that firstborn is a positional description is verified again at the end of verse 18. A super important word that starts the last part of this verse is the word so. It is like the word therefore, in that everything prior to the word so applies to the last statement in the verse. It says, "So that he might become the one who is first in all things." The key word here is first. The Greek word protouo, meaning to be first in rank or have preeminence. That's why the ASV and the KJV read that he has preeminence. So the word first in Greek protos is connected back with the firstborn in verse 15 and 18 with the word prototokos by sharing the same root word. Now if they're not satisfied with that because they're still stuck to their English mindset that firstborn can only mean first child birth, then swing them over to Revelation 1:5. It reads in the ASV, "And from Jesus Christ, who is the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth." There's our firstborn description again. The faithful witness is a positional statement about Christ being our mediator, and him being called the ruler of the kings of the earth is as well. So again, do you think firstborn of the dead was now John embedding another out of context in there? The New World Translation even includes quotation marks around these descriptions to indicate they are referring to titles or ranks. Now if you can sense defiance or reluctance still in the air, then here's your Joe Frazier left hook. Psalm 89:27. The New World Translation reads, "And I will place him as firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth." This is initially talking about King David, and we know that David was the 7th born of Jesse, so it fails on that note. And obviously, firstborn is defined in the verse meaning the highest ranking king on the earth. So does Colossians 1:15 and 18 describe Jesus having a beginning? No, it is entirely about his position or his rank. John also uses it in the same manner in Revelation 1:5, and the knockout blow of Psalm 89:27 absolutely leaves no doubt that the firstborn of creation and of the dead is 100% about Jesus' rank and rulership. Now I hope that would be sufficient for anyone, but if you need a spare, just swing them back to Exodus 4:22. Here Israel is called God's son and firstborn. So just ask, how could both Jesus and Israel be called Jehovah's firstborn son? Their brain might just melt at this point, but regardless of all of this clearly demonstrates their interpretation to be wrong, you have to remain patient and loving throughout it. Don't turn it into a battle of wits. When shields go up, nothing productive will come from it. So a reminder to look in the description below to download the handouts and click on the subscribe button because it's free and it does make me feel better about what I'm doing here. In the meantime, stay salty. Jesus is then recorded raising 3 people before his own resurrection. Then after his resurrection, we have those who came out of their graves, Peter raising Tabitha and Paul raising Eutychus.